On today's episode of the Unveil podcast, I have the pleasure of sitting down with Dr. Roger Jahnke, OMD. Dr. Roger is one of the most respected luminaries in the fields of evidence-based mind-body practice, wellness, integrative medicine, and Chinese medicine for self-transformation. He has dedicated his professional life to sharing the ancient holistic empowerment and healing traditions of China, distilled for contemporary times. This conversation really takes on a life of its own when we discuss all things Chinese medicine and homeopathic medicine. We discuss all about Roger's life and what took him to where he is now, which is he is the director and chief instructor of the Institute of Integral Qigong and Tai Chi in Santa Barbara, California. And he and his colleagues have trained over 3,000 Tai Chi and Qigong teachers and practice leaders internationally. This is a conversation which is actually much more grounded than you might think. We do go into traditional Chinese techniques, and we honestly dig into the way of therapeutics when it comes from a non-Western lens. I really hope that you enjoyed this conversation. This was a lot of fun for me, and I'm sure that you will have a lot of fun listening. With that, all that's left to say is enjoy this week's episode of the Unveil podcast. I am very much looking forward to my interview today, everyone. I have the wonderful Dr. Roger Jahnke on my podcast, and I am so excited because we share some historical kind of understandings from the Chinese medicine lens. And there's a lot of kind of shared understanding that we've just spoken about in our brief 10 minutes before we press record. And so I'm delighted to have you here today to talk to my audience, to share your wisdom and your insights. So welcome, Roger, to my podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm just delighted to be here and to get to know you. And one of the things that I love the most is that there's this massive community of people, I don't know, shall we say like us, but we could say with shared values. And so I'm just thrilled always to meet another of them. And what a blessing to see you. And your listeners. Hello, everyone.
It's wonderful. We were just saying before I started recording that this isn't my job, my full-time job, but yet it feels like a full-time job. But it also feels like the most fun I can have because I legitimately get to have geeky conversations with people who are really fascinating and also who are sharing this similar vibration, similar drive, similar passion for lots of things, but mostly the healing arts and the world. So with that kind of like teaser, I'd love to ask you my kind of opening question, just so my
Sure.
listeners get a bit familiar with who you are. Could you just share with us the sort of 30,000 foot view of not just who you are, but how you serve?
Yeah, thank you. So I'm from a place called Ohio, Cincinnati, Ohio. I currently live in Santa Barbara, California. And Ohio was an amazing place to grow up as a child. It's probably a kind of conservative place, but I didn't know anything about that. And I think I'm probably quite conservative. I like conserving trees. I like conserving everything that we don't eat from our meals. And I put those things that I conserve into my compost pile. So I don't know. I think I'm probably quite a conservative. And one of the other things that I think is very important is conserving chi, life force, conserving personal energy, and being deliberate about how I spend my energy and how and who I listen to. And I prefer, rather than listening to what people think I should be doing, to listen to people who inform me about how I can make decisions on my own about anything that I wish to do or want to do or am thinking about doing. And so, I went to school and I went to college, and my dad died when I was a youngster, so that was a traumatic experience, and frankly, it transformed me into a person who wanted to be a doctor from a person who wanted to be a baseball player. So I'm actually quite thankful that I ended up being a doctor rather than a baseball player. And I don't know, in a kind of weird way, I appreciate my dad for giving me that because he was a conservative too. And I think I probably would have ended up uh, inheriting the business, which was a business that had a bunch of trucks with stuff on them that were traveling all over the portion of the United States that's east of the Mississippi.
Mm.
And so I went to medical school and found out that there was nothing about medicine at the time. This is like, I can't even believe I'm saying this. This is actually in the last millennium, quite deep into the last millennium. It feels like 1,000 years ago. The medical school at the University of Cincinnati had no idea about the value of health,
Mm.
maximization, health, sustainability, any of that kind of stuff. So I quit medical school, built a house in the forest, grew some herbs, and got all hopped up on that. And then found out about Chinese medicine, which is based on herbs. And at the same time, I was hanging around with this ancient MD who was a homeopath. And the reason why I got so interested in homeopathy was that for my whole life, I had respiratory challenges. And I went to this homeopath, and he gave me one dose of a powder that he poured out onto like a little, looked like a cigarette paper. He poured it under my tongue and he said, while we have the rest of our conversation, just hold that under your tongue. I never had any kind of notable respiratory challenge. Okay, so I traveled a lot and I had some experience of getting some flus on the airplanes and so forth. But the main thing is that I developed then and I have now a fairly strong immune system. And so I'm just a kind of a radical fan of what we now call, first it was natural healing, then it was holistic medicine, then it was an alternative medicine, then it was complementary medicine, and now it's a whole bunch of things. It's integrative medicine, it's functional medicine, it's lifestyle medicine, it's boutique medicine, it's precision medicine. And so, that brings us up to present moment. By the way, I studied Chinese medicine, had a 35, 40-year clinical as the chief of staff of a clinic here in Santa Barbara, which was really a whole lot like, I think, your place in Austin, Texas. And so then I retired from that. There's a reason for that. We can talk about it later if you want to, but mainly it's just retired from that and then became the director of what is called the Institute of Integral Qigong and Tai Chi, because Qigong and Tai Chi are the methods in Chinese medicine that you use to maximize healing resources within your own being, which was always my main interest.
Mm.
And we've trained about somewhere around 3,000 people to be coaches, life coaches, and qigong teachers, and tai chi teachers, and mind body practice teachers, and yeah, that brings us up to the present.
Amazing. And everyone who listens, who's a regular listener, will now know exactly why you're on this podcast, because we share so many of these kind of like this integrative medicine thing with the Chinese history and all that kind of stuff. But I actually want to start us with the Chinese medicine, because I think people say Chinese medicine and I don't think everyone really understands what we're talking about. And because you're the first kind of Chinese medicine expert I have on this podcast, I really want to firstly dig into Qi. And I really want you to give us the explanation of what Qi is. And I know this is like super simple basics for you, but I really feel like sometimes we misunderstand and we don't really get the information. We just get the sort of take home message. And I really would love you to just explore Qi for a moment for our listeners.
Sure. So before we do it, let's do this. In the Western world, we got interested somewhere around the beginning of the Common Calendar, a little bit before, Hippocrates was there, and Aristotle was there, and we got eventually we really got addicted to the idea of trying to understand the world by taking it apart. And many of these other cultures, I like to call them shamanic cultures. They're also indigenous cultures.
Mm-hmm.
Um, they, for reasons that are not particularly easy to understand, but we can discuss if you want to, they did not get triggered by this idea of needing to understand or even discuss the possibility of understanding
Mm-hmm.
everything.
Mm.
And so here we are in the Western world, basically ruining the world, trying to figure out what it does. And then, of course, you get a bunch of people in there who see an opportunity, and so that opportunistically, as we separate things, we can figure out how to make a diamond. We can make like it takes thousands of years and tons of pressure to make a diamond. We can actually make a diamond in a laboratory. It's even a little bit like a regular diamond. You can pretend it's a regular diamond. You can make a lot of money doing that. You can extract oil, all that stuff. So uh, I have always trended to be curious about these cultures that did not take the bait on the deconstruction methodology of figuring out the world. And so the above the big mountain, it's chi. Below the big mountain, it's prana. If you go to every African nation, and I don't mean political nation, I mean original nation of tribal associations, they have their words. There are many of them. I studied Chinese medicine in Hawaii, and in Hawaii, it's called manna, and the Hebrews use the same kind of what would you call it, syllable. They have manna, and manna, and there are many other terms for this. Uh, Here comes the answer. This ubiquitous presence that is distributed across all dimensions and beyond. And so when a society says to themselves, or a culture or a tribe or a group of people sitting around a fire, and they say like, well, how does this all work? They're uh, and the Druids did it too. I mean, the Druids ended up coming under the Romans and being destroyed, and of course all the witches were burned and so forth. But um, so it was this idea was true in Europe as well, until it wasn't. But it's this concept of some kind of invisible, and I halt at invisible because there are many people who have a kind of sensibility to be able to visualize, probably not using these eyes, but some capacity that we have to see, uh, who actually see this invisible energy, which is ubiquitous throughout the world. So that ubiquitous presence that we like to call an energy is present in me, in every part of me. It's present in you, in every part of you. It's present in the space between us. It's present in trees and rocks and furniture and cars and everything else that there is. And we know from physics that everything that shows up as being material is actually at a level we call quantum, not a material at all. And so, to some extent, there's just nothing in the world that isn't chi, and there's nothing in the world that isn't infused with chi. So then we can ask the question, how is it that chi becomes more or less functional in a person? Because we could also say, how is it that chi becomes more or less functional in a tree, or if chi becomes more or less functional in a diamond, or chi becomes more or less functional in a dream? And so we as humans are particularly interested on how to be more well and how to be more uh, resilient and how to be more self-determining. I would like to say that that's a big power around qi. Function is physical, but there's a level of function of the aspect of ourself that we call the mind and the emotions or the feelings. Feelings is kind of interesting because feelings are both physical and emotional. So in Qigong, we say all the time, we say, turn your attention inward and notice how you're feeling. And so we could also say, turn your attention inward and notice what you're feeling. So when we say what you're feeling, it's kind of like I'm tingling, I feel a sensation. How I'm feeling seems a little bit more like, am I tapping into sadness? Am I tapping into jubilation? And I think you understand what I mean. So then the question becomes, and I'm sorry I'm asking all the questions that you would ask, but I'm just kind of following it in order. So I hope that's okay.
Mm.
Well, what about the difference between the liver chi and the heart chi?
Mm.
And is there something that defines them as being unique as opposed to just this ubiquitous field of presence?
Mm.
And it gets kind of philosophical there
Mm-hmm.
because science, the most advanced science that has ever existed in the human race, if we think that contemporary science is the most advanced science, I actually think that subjective shamanic science is more interesting because it's more conservative.
Mm.
It doesn't tear things apart, it
Mm-hmm.
leaves things whole.
Mm.
And so ancient science looks at things carefully and notices how things operate, whereas we use a lot of dynamite, a lot of knives, and a lot of saws to be able to see if we can figure out how nature works, and then we get caught in wanting to exploit nature as opposed to actually learning about it. And so the heart has a discrete, uh, shall we say, expression of the chi. The liver has a discrete expression of the chi. The brain has a discrete expression of the chi. And to some extent, it is directly in relationship with the functional capacity of the organ. So let's say, for instance, we've poisoned our liver, we've clogged our heart, and we've scrambled our mind. Well, then that chi that has all of that capacity is basically repressed or restrained. And so is it possible that how a person is, both through their behaviors and their genetics, will have certain, shall we say, qualities of the chi that are different from other persons? And of course, all trees are a little bit different. It matters what soil they're planted in, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the bottom line of what we're getting at here is that chi is something that is everywhere, including within ourselves, and also in every uh, solar system, galaxy, super galaxy, universe, and multiverse. And so, but we're most concerned about the chi of ourselves. And so then the chi of ourselves can be restrained or restricted, or it can be cultivated by the person who owns the vehicle. And if the person is not oriented enough to be able to take care of themselves, then they can ask a doctor of Chinese medicine. Or if they're interested in how the chi is more like prana, then they can ask a doctor of Ayurvedic medicine. And if they're more interested in how the chi is manifest through the paradigm of homeopathy, then they can ask a homeopath. But all those people are going to be doing the same thing, and that is removing restraint from the ample and harmonious presence of this universal resource, which is within us and even near us and around us and everywhere. What do you think?
I love it. I love that I said this is a really simple question, and you just because, and the reason I love that you just went into all of that detail is because I love that you drew the links to everything else that this is related to, because I for so long have felt like modern science is just contextualizing very ancient wisdoms and thinking it's a novel concept. And actually, there was a study released, I don't know, yesterday or something like that, where science has proved that the moon affects female menstrual cycles. I'm like, I mean, thanks, science, but every woman
thank
knew
God.
that.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Right, precisely. And it's like, I was basically a bit pleased because they were actually studying women for a change instead of just RCTs with men. But there was that moment where you're just like, who spent money on that? Like, why? And I feel like there's also this element of every person that I speak to in this world who maybe has gone into a methodology and then kind of come to the end of something or found their way through all gets to this same point of there's like a bottom up and a top down way to support humaning, and so much of it is in the life force essence, which is not the right word to use for chi, but it's kind of in there in terms of that sense of that sense of being. And everything that I've always done, especially within Unveil and the podcast, the reason it's called Unveil is because everything we do is about removal. We want to remove the veils. We want to remove the stuff that is in between the flow of vitality and the way we're actually living. And so it's beautiful that I get so many people from their own lens speaking to the same essential concept of this unleashing the resource that is our own innate healing or life superpowers.
Yes, amen.
And what I also love about the way you spoke is like just speaking of the chi of different organs and then tying it to Ayurveda, because like some people get competitive about this. There's kind of like they have a dog in the fight and want one of these systems to win. But I really love that you kind of can see all these links. So from there, I would really love to understand just give us some simple ideas of how somebody listening to this podcast today could maybe think about cultivating chi and what that might mean, and how just in their own world, without necessarily needing to consult a practitioner of any of the disciplines, what might it look like to develop a practice which is allowing them to become more in alignment with themselves?
Yeah, so that's a beautiful question, and it has just a gorgeous answer. And it kind of goes back to the fact that we just figured out that the moon has some kind of effect on female cycles, and it goes like this. In the earliest known written texts of the tribes of China, and we could say the same thing about the earliest known texts of India. And we could say the same about the earliest known texts of the Egyptians. And, we just go all the way through all of the cultures that wrote things down. And remember that Africans didn't write things down, the Native Americans didn't write things down, even the Druids kind of didn't write things down. They had secret societies and they handed things off by, and so Newton came along and, cracked the code and all those kinds of things. So in the Chinese version of this thing or this idea or this set of concepts that existed previous to writing, because if you start writing and you're already writing about something, then that means that you already knew about it. And then we get to ask the question, well, when did you figure this out? And the answer is, well, we didn't figure it out just before we started writing. And human beings have, hung around fires, they've built places to live, they've had families, they've communicated with each other for like a really long time. The human gene is 3 million years old. And we have found organized burial sites that are now up to 1 million years old. And the discovery of fire is somewhere around 1 million years. And the idea that the only thing that people talked about was food and sex is, immensely naive. So, this system that we now call wellness was articulated by the Chinese as yang sheng, Yang, second word Sheng. And just to parallel it with something, the in India, Ayurved isn't a medical system. It's a living system.
Mm.
And Yang Sheng means nourishing life. So it doesn't mean diagnosing diseases, and it doesn't mean treating diseases. It means nourishing the aspect of ourself that supports us in not having diseases. And this is an onboard, inherent, innate capacity, which most people pay no attention to because they think they should wait until they're so sick that they need a doctor and then try to figure out, have somebody else do something to them, which is also immensely naive and actually a kind of I'm just going to say, I think it's an expression of stupidity. For people, okay, wait a minute, there's ignorance. So if you're kept from knowing, then you're ignorant. If you know and don't do anything about it, then you're stupid. And it's for almost everybody that lives in the modern world, it's one or the other of those. Because our great grandmothers knew about these things. And I'll describe a Yang Sheng in a moment, but historically, just present moment, really interesting thing to say is that when things started to fire up in the Ukraine, I became absolutely fascinated on YouTube with videos about people who live in places like Slovenia and Romania and Ukraine and etc. And these videos are almost always around the subject of food. So, in other words, there's a little house and the mountains are beautiful and the garden is there and there's some goats and so then there's fruit trees and then they're collecting food from the garden and then they're making a dish, some kind of a dish. And so you get to see the environment, the self-sufficiency lifestyle and so forth in modern contemporary time. It's amazing. So I recommend that everybody go to YouTube and look up videos about preparing food in traditional Ukrainian, Slovenian, Romanian, and all those, and the Istan, all the Istans, if you know what I mean, Pakistans and Uzbekistans, and there's videos from all these places. It's just amazing. Okay, so back to Yang Sheng, nourishing life. So nourishing life is composed of nutrition, sleep, hydration, physical activity, meditation, having a philosophy, and a few other things like, everybody's always hopped up on the sex thing. So there's always a chapter in Yang Sheng about how to conserve your personal vitality under the auspices of being conservative sexually. We could talk for a whole weekend on just that one topic. And so these are the same things. I mean, it doesn't say don't smoke for whatever reason. I guess maybe they weren't rolling their own at the time or something like that.
Yeah, potentially.
It's a little less about prohibitions
Right.
and taboos and a
Yeah.
little more about solutions.
Mm.
And so, and we just figured out that sleep is ample sleep is one of the most important things that you can do to prevent depression and anxiety. And we've just figured out that sitting is the new smoking, meaning that if you don't move, you're going to be as at risk for disease than you would be if you were a smoker. And so we're finding out, now that all these things that we made fun of these people for being primitive, and by the way, let's just take a moment on primitive. Primitive does not mean stupid, uninformed. What it means is first. It's the only thing that primitive means is first, or you could say original. And so were these people okay? It's true. They do not have stock accounts. They didn't get involved in the recent crypto winter.
Mm-hmm.
They don't drive around in big cars. In fact, kind of an interesting thing is to ask as an anthropologist, and I happen to just be interested in a lot of different things. If you ask the question, why did certain cultures not use the wheel? Why did certain cultures not use the wheel? And the answer is they had plenty of round things around, but they didn't use the wheel because they knew that if they carried whatever it was they were going to put into a wheeled vehicle, including their own body, that they would always be a healthier person.
Mm.
And probably some shaman or star reader or something like that said, if you use that wheel, it's a slippery slope. You're going to end up drilling for oil and buying stuff on Amazon. And why don't we just keep our little tiny scanty clothes and our tiny little bow and arrows and our our houses, that when the wind comes along and blows our house down, we just build another one.
Mm.
So Yang Sheng. And I'm sorry I had to bury it in all of that other information. But I think when people hear, like, you should do Yang Sheng, and here's what it is.
Mm-hmm.
And what I want to do is I want to support people in thinking, are you kidding? We actually knew this 100, 200,000 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And even my grandmother probably knew some of it, or at least my great grandmother knew some of it.
Mm-hmm.
And now I don't.
Mm.
Who did that? Why
Mm.
did that happen?
Mm.
And what am I going to do about it?
Mm-hmm.
Besides just hydrating and resting,
Mm.
I want to become a warrior. And I don't mean a man warrior. I don't mean a killer warrior, and I don't mean somebody who's all geared up to fire large uh, uh, ammunition. I'm talking about a warrior of the spirit
Mm.
who is not only able to take care of themselves, but takes care of themselves so that they can take care of those who have been injured
Mm.
or who need some time to recover themselves.
Mm. Mm-hmm. I'm really fascinated by what you share. And I'm going to ask this question, and it may go nowhere, but I'm kind of getting the sense of, from the way you speak about things, that I suspect that you have some opinions on kind of the recent divisiveness in cultures and the globe and what's been happening in the last few years. If you have anything to share in terms of what you're seeing in the trends and what you're recognizing in what's happening, I'd really love any insights or wisdom you have, because it feels like underneath what you're saying is this kind of personal empowerment piece of like awareness and knowledge and doing things for yourself. And I'd really love for you to just speak a little bit on what you're seeing in the world right now, what you're kind of seeing in the shifts that are happening.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's one of the most important topics that we can talk about, and I want to preface what I say by saying that everything that I could ever say on this or anything else is an opinion.
Mm.
And whatever the Pope says is an opinion. Now, whatever the president says is an opinion. So, whatever the person who says that read this book, and even though I didn't read it, you should do what I think you should do, like any of that. So, I just want to bring it back to this is an opinion.
Mm.
So, as a fairly observant person, and I want to just say something about observing. In China, there's a place. It's called a guan, Guan. And originally, a guan was a place in nature for observation. And so the question is, when the ancient Chinese were they observing just the nature around them? Or were they observing the nature around them and the stars? Or were they traveling around and observing everything that they could find to observe? Or were they also observing within them? And the concept of a guan is an observatory. And we think of observatories as being for looking out. But if you read the texts from China, which includes things like the Tao Te Ching, the writings of an important philosopher named Chuang-Tzu, and maybe we can put some of this stuff in the show notes.
Mm-hmm.
There's a beautiful text from China called Internal Observation, or also it's called Internal Enterprise. In other words, what kind of enterprising things are going on inside of a person? It's really interesting. And so I am just a down into it as every waking and as much of my sleep time as possible fan of empowered observation.
Mm-hmm.
So what I say now about the geopolitical or whatever it is just an opinion based on personal observation, which I do a lot of.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't I don't have a television. I do have a television, but I use it to 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 use YouTube.
Mm.
And so I can go to a place called Fox News, and check it all out. And I can go over to CNN and check that all out. And then I can go to my favorite non-corporate sources and check those out. And so I feel pretty informed, and I'm totally nonpartisan. So what I see is, we've already talked about it, is that somewhere along the line, opportunistic exploitation overtook holism. And I think you can follow it back into the whole idea of trying to figure out how the world works by taking it apart.
Mm.
And Francis Bacon is famous for saying, and actually calling it Mother Nature. In other words, ascribing a feminine quality to it.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm paraphrasing, but Francis Bacon, a famous Renaissance philosopher and scientist, said, "We will torture the truth out of her." And so I think it probably goes maybe earlier to Aristotle and a few others. But the point is that if we start to take things apart in a kind of like practical sense, instead of leaving everything whole in a kind of practical and spiritual sense, that we're on a slippery slope. And that's why I said what I said about the wheel. I think that there are actually people who said at some point, don't touch that wheel, because it's going to take you to where all these people in those helicopters with their movie cameras who are circling around your village and making a movie about primitive people, whatever happened to them, do not let that happen here.
Mm.
And so then what happens is that, this is my view, is that people who are interested in mining, and I don't mean just mining for elements, I mean mining for customers.
Mm.
And then if you eliminate, like in my town, we used to have 3 amazing bookstores.
Mm.
And whenever that first one came along, that kind of corporate one, which was so cool because they had coffee and so forth,
Mm-hmm.
2 of those bookstores went out of business.
Mm.
But Barnes and Noble stayed until Amazon, and
Mm.
now Barnes and Noble is gone.
Mm-hmm.
But we only have one bookstore who survived all of that, and they're just mean spirited, and I mean like that kind of mean spirited, like
Mm-hmm.
don't tread on us. They've got like books
Mm.
on the shelves, they got books in the aisles, they've got books in the back room, and it's really a
Mm.
cool place to just go and like look for a book. And then there's a bunch of people who work there who
Mm-hmm.
kind of know how to find it if it's not on the shelf and so forth. It's a sort of kind of wizardry almost. So if we were to cook it into one word, I would say 2 words: the elites.
Mm.
The elites have basically eliminated self-determinism. The elites have eliminated the personal sovereignty. People can't figure out how to have a relationship. They have to have a lawyer. People can't figure out how to stay well. They need a neurosurgeon.
Mm.
And the 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 mythology that so many people have become allured into
Mm.
is that's how it goes. That's how it works. And in fact, that is the modern world. That's the breakthroughs of all that has come from torturing the truth out of Mother Nature,
Mm.
is that we have ultimate levels of convenience.
Mm-hmm.
It is not convenient to change your diet. It is not convenient to exercise. It's
Mm.
not convenient to learn about the truth. And I don't mean like truth social. I mean real truth, like the kind of truth that you feel to be true because you've looked into it and you've talked about it and you've thought about it carefully.
Mm. Mm. I was educating my students today about some of this, some of the elements. We were doing like a physiology pillar of stuff, and we were talking about, someone had asked about the hormones related to food behaviors. And I sort of had to end up saying, well, it doesn't really matter the hormones related to food behaviors because the big companies, the elites have worked out how to hack that. And so we are almost, unless we try, which is effort, which is not convenient, we are a little bit powerless because they're equipped to harness our animalistic selves and actually do damage. And it feels like, as to your point earlier, it feels like so obvious and common sense to someone like me that that's what's happening. But I do have some compassion for the ignorance, the people who just don't understand and maybe feel shame and guilt around various elements. But it is hard. And I mean, I'm not going to sit on this podcast and say I don't shop at Amazon and I don't do things for convenience, because I absolutely do.
Yeah.
But the part of me inside feels just, sometimes I feel the friction in me of like, this feels convenient and I did it this morning. I really need something. I'm going away tomorrow and I need to have it delivered today between 5 and 10 p.m. And it's like, I need it. And also I could find a way to get to a store. That's the truth. I could find a way to get to a store. I could find a way to, but there's so many things in this that I feel
Yeah, it's big. It's a big one.
it's a big one.
It's a big tangle. Right now, we've here as consumers, we said this. We better, just personal view. I don't think anybody else should think this same thing. It
Mm-hmm.
would be better if we had a solar battery. And so I went to Amazon and paid $2,000 for a battery that's about, when you think about that little tiny battery that you put in your flashlight, I have a battery that's like this wide and this high
Hmm.
and this thick.
Hmm.
And you put some panels out in the sun and you fire it up. And then if heaven forbid, the grid goes down, we have that. And, and I went to all the hardware stores near me and it just wasn't right. I bought a shovel off of Amazon, and it's a damn fine shovel, and I was able to like compare it to a lot of other shovels.
Right.
So
And get reviews for all the shovels. I mean, they're hacking our exact humanness. And that's what makes me mad sometimes. And then I think about all the people who run these tech companies, especially the ones with children who don't let their own children use their own platforms. And
uh,
that speaks absolute volumes to me. Hmm. So within all of this, I'd love for you to talk to us a little bit about homeopathy, because I know that's a big passion of yours. Your story, your little tidbit of a story from earlier is powerful. And I feel like it's one of those, I think people kind of get on board a little bit with Chinese medicine. They get it. They kind of understand, doing Tai Chi or whatever it is. And they almost, but some people really dismiss homeopathy. It's really it's just sugar water. So I would love for you to just speak to my listeners a little bit about your sense of homeopathy, why it speaks to you, the truth of homeopathy. I'd love to give you a platform just to discuss that for a bit.
yeah, thank you. Being from Cincinnati and having had the opportunity to study Chinese medicine in Hawaii and to go to China like 10 times to really get a personal view of all this stuff. I also had this experience as I described, and then when I came back from Hawaii as a doctor of Chinese medicine, I went to a place called Columbus, Ohio, and talked to a guy there that I had seen give a lecture. And I said, he's an osteopath, and this is in 1977. And my original experience with the homeopath was back in the very late 60s. And I said to this guy who ran this clinic that basically you and I are modeling after now. This guy started in the late 1940s with this
Mm.
clinic, and he had the naturopaths who had been shut down, and the homeopaths that had been shut down, and the chiropractors that had been shut down, and somehow the osteopaths were able to kind of navigate that and keep
Mhm.
things in order. And so he was harboring all these characters in this clinic. And he said, "Oh my gosh, we always wanted to have a Chinese medicine department, and you can be the chief of staff." So, like, I've just graduated from Chinese medicine school, and I'm now the chief of staff at what we would call a holistic clinic in 1977 in Columbus, Ohio.
Mm.
And this doctor was very interested in homeopathy. And so it kind of rang as I was there, to jump back into the homeopathic situation. And, I got myself up to speed. And of course, homeopathy is a kind of energy medicine, and Chinese medicine is a kind of energy medicine. And it was always kind of frustrating that the science on homeopathy is kind of uh, it's repressed, it's tangled up, it's very
Mm.
difficult to point to the science uh, in even in contemporary time.
Mhm.
But check this out: in Columbus, Ohio, at Ohio State University,
Mm.
the library is named the Hahnemann Library.
Wow, really?
Yeah, yeah. And and there were homeopathic schools all over the United States, and homeopathy was a very foundational kind of medicine in the late 1800s, before what they called the Flexner Report. We could talk about that on another podcast if you want to.
Mhm.
But so I would go into this library, and above the public floor, there were a couple of floors, and then there was like a third floor or a fourth floor, which you couldn't go to. And I've always been super curious. And so
Don't put a no, do not enter sign. I'm definitely going in.
so I found this doorway that was unlocked in the entire floor. And I'm talking like many thousands of feet, square feet of floor space. And almost all of that was homeopathy.
Wow.
And then years later, I went back and it was gone. Ugh. So let's pass on that because that was basically mountains and mountains of papers and articles and journals. There, the United States during the heyday of homeopathy had something like 30 homeopathic journals. Every little region had a journal. And so I thought, okay, I'll just go to the basics and do the repertorizing, and I'll forget about trying to prove it by reading it somewhere.
Yeah.
I'm going to prove it by using it. And so what I learned using homeopathy is that if you get the right remedy, it's like a miracle. And if you don't, nothing happens. And so I've met a lot of people who said they went to a homeopath and it didn't work for them. And what I believe to be true is that for reasons that are not that easy to describe, the right remedy was not utilized, and the person had greater expectations, thinking that, okay, if you don't figure it out the first time, then this is voodoo. And so a lot of people have a negative experience of homeopathy. And so over time, I just saw all these amazing things happen. And there were times when we would try something and it wasn't the one, and that person would fall into that particular category of, well, I don't want to do that. Although homeopathy is probably the cheapest kind of medicine there is. Chinese herbs are very expensive. Western herbs are very expensive. Homeopathic remedies are like under, like $7 to $10, maybe $12 a piece. Yeah. So you can get it wrong like a lot of times for the same price that you can get a drug that may have horrible side effects, right, but has an immediate, like, yeah, the doc got it. So beyond that, there's 3 levels of homeopathy. The first level is anybody can do it by just going to the internet and putting in some keywords. And remember what I said, for the price of any other kind of medicine, which would cost you $30 or $50 or $70, you can try 10 homeopathic remedies. So that's the self-educated person. Then the second one is a person who's putting more time into it, someone who's a clinician and who's a little more careful and can do a little bit more, but you're going to have to pay for that person's time. And that's called just like what we would call, everyday prescribing. And then there's something called, the third one is called constitutional homeopathics, which is where you have a person who's pretty much like a wizard, who follows the very same rules that the simple practitioner follows, but who does it all day, every day, and works with a range of potencies that are very difficult to learn how to work with and weave. Yeah. And so I'll leave it there, because the third one, maybe you want to buy one of those someday. The second one, maybe you want to buy one of those someday. But the first one is go to Google and figure out 4 or 5 remedies, and then study just a little bit. Like, you put into Google something like, what kinds of expectations should I have if I'm going to be self-prescribing homeopathy?
Mm.
And then there's some blogs out there and so
Mhm.
forth that'll say,
Mm.
well, don't expect anything right away. You might get
Mhm.
it wrong.
Mhm.
Got to be vigilant. Change your diet, get your exercise. All the health
Mhm.
stuff weaves in.
Mhm. Mm.
Back to you, Victoria.
I think that's interesting because I think a lot of people expect pills to be like pills of medicine, like pharmaceuticals. And so I think they do think that if it doesn't have like an ingredient that is listable, that has an instant impact, it doesn't do anything. And I mean, I've had the experience of a proper constitutional homeopath, and it's complicated. Now, I'm intelligent. I like to think of my brain as very functional, and I wouldn't choose to study homeopathy. It is supremely complex, and it's kind of no, honestly, like I looked at it and I was like, this is like, I always think of it like the alethiometer in His Dark Materials, the trilogy, where like she's trying to look at the many different layers of the meaning of symbols, and it's the same thing. It's like it's not just one remedy, and it has to match and contrast and do all the right things. And if you get it wrong, the beauty of this is if you get it wrong, nothing happens.
Nothing
And
happened.
it's so easy to experiment with. So I love that you gave everyone the Google version. I'm normally telling people not to go to Dr. Google, but homeopathic Dr. Google will give you permission to go and look at. So, with all of this said and all of these concepts kind of discussed, I'd love to just understand a bit more about you and how you spend your daily life now. I do want to go back and double click on the why we left the Santa Barbara clinic because you dropped a kind of like teaser and I need to know the answer.
Yeah, well,
So,
let me
I'd
tell
love
you
to know
that one
that.
very well.
Mm,
It's a really short story. Chinese medicine is amazing. And having a clinical practice where you can do Chinese medicine and homeopathy and herbal medicine and have massage practitioners and have health coaches and do Qigong and Tai Chi classes, right? I mean,
awesome. Yeah.
that's incredible.
Mm-hmm.
So the allure of being in relationships with people who are trying to become more well, and I get to be the detective who figures it out, is totally compelling.
Mm-hmm.
Loved it. And all those systems for helping people are very powerful.
Mm-hmm.
But here's the thing that I started to notice after like when you meet a new lover and it's all the lights come on and you're just flipped out and it's like you don't even care like the details. Let's just do this, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I was in that, my wife and I, we call that the luminescence. I was in the luminescent phase of being a clinician.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually I began to realize that the people who were my clients, patients, were not interested in learning.
Mm-hmm.
They wanted an expert to fix them. And at the same time, I was doing Qigong classes.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I thought about it, in the Qigong classes, every person there wanted to learn. In my clinical experience,
Mm-hmm.
probably 25% of everybody who was there wanted to learn.
Mm-hmm.
So, as an idealist,
Mm-hmm.
um, because there's another topic called the money. But as an idealist,
Mm-hmm.
I said to myself, these people are 100% interested. These people are 25% interested. Why would I hang around with these people?
Mm-hmm.
Let them go to somebody else,
Mm-hmm.
and I will be the Qigong guy.
Mm-hmm.
So I talked to my wife about it. Uh, she thought it was a good idea because the clinic was very complex
Mm-hmm.
and bricks and mortar and all that stuff.
Yep.
And so she said, when you go to China, I'm going to shut the clinic down and put everything in the garage. And so when I got back from that trip to China, the clinic was closed and everything was in the garage. So I didn't have to make that very gritty, challenging decision.
Mm-hmm.
And then looking back for the next couple of years, I realized, ooh, that was a financial
Right.
not really a very smart financial decision. But that all worked itself out. I wrote a couple of books. I work with the Esalen Institute, Omega, Kripalu, 1440, all the uh, IONS, Institute of Noetic Science, all
Mhm.
those places have been uh, a part of my uh, business. I also
Mhm.
trained myself as a consultant, took a few courses and became an organizational development consultant and
Mm.
got hired by a bunch of hospitals and uh, uh, municipalities and so forth to help build up wellness programs and integrative medicine programs, which was, I love the consulting because you can sort of overcharge these elite organizations.
Mhm.
And anyway, we won't go there, but
Mm.
it's just fun to make really good uh, income
Mm.
from an organization that's basically making money on hospital beds and pharmaceuticals.
Mm.
Want to bring some of that cash back home and plant a garden and plant some fruit trees and
Of
get
course.
ready for the world to
Yeah.
collapse if that's what's going to happen.
Yes. Yeah. The
So
life
I
cycle of money.
basically I just quit. I just quit. I got tired of those people, and
Mm.
being around people who are interested in qigong is so much more satisfying.
Mhm. Mhm. And so that brings me on to my kind of final question. What does your daily life look like at the moment? You obviously are teaching the qigong. What's the kind of habit that you keep and the kind of stuff that you're offering? I will put links to your books in the show notes because I have your books and they are really worth a read if anyone's interested
Mm.
in any of this stuff. So I'll make sure those are in the show notes. But talk to us a little bit about the teaching of qigong and what your daily life looks like now.
Yeah, my daily life since the worldwide infectious problem, um, I was traveling almost 6 months out of a year,
Yeah.
which was fantastic, and I loved it.
Mhm.
It wasn't really very good for my health,
Mhm.
and I ended up kind of with some little bits of syndrome this and syndrome that.
Mm.
And I was trying to figure out how to cut back, and here comes Corona, and I got it all cut back for me. I didn't have to decide like who to talk to or what to say. It was just like, boom,
Mhm.
done.
Mhm.
And so I haven't traveled. I went to Albuquerque for the energy medicine, energy psychology conference
Mhm.
in May. But otherwise, I have not traveled since 2019.
Mm.
And so my entire world has changed. And our trainings are now online.
Mhm.
And the Omega Institute and Kripalu have opened back up and so forth. And so I'm going to travel east one time this year. So not 4 or 5 times, just one time.
Mhm.
And so I had a homestead in Appalachian, Ohio. I built houses, I planted trees, I gardened.
Mm.
My first business was a garden store called Yerba Santa in this place called Athens, Ohio,
Mhm.
which was like a little Madison,
Mhm.
Wisconsin, or Boulder or something like that. And so uh, I live in a suburban neighborhood,
Mhm.
and my front yard was a fried lawn for all those years. And my wife Rebecca, she's the inventor of a life coaching program, and so
Mhm.
we have a lot of shared values. And so remember, we're talking about the Guan as an place of observation. We
Mhm.
decided to transform our home into a Guan. And so there's a fence there, so we don't see the road anymore. There's a forest on the other side of our house. We have fruit trees along one side of
Mhm.
our house and a garden. And we've been making compost. I've been making compost for so long that I actually used to, when I lived at a like a group, typically I would live with a bunch of people in a big house.
Mhm.
We'd make compost. Well, I'd actually take the compost from there and move it to the next place.
Mhm.
And so when we moved in here 35 years ago,
Mhm.
I brought a big pile of compost, and we've been making compost ever since. 4 raised beds. So what I like to do is be active.
Mm-hmm.
I think the most important part of Yang Sheng is physical activity.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you have good physical activity, you're much more likely to sleep. And if you
Right.
have good physical activity, you're much more likely to take deep breaths just spontaneously.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have physical activity doing something like gardening and deciding what to do next, or choosing
Mm-hmm.
stones and putting stones in different places, that's a kind of presencing.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's how my personal life goes. And I'm writing a next book, and it's hard for me to write during the day, so I've been getting up at 4:30 and writing then.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm also doing a lot of teaching online with different organizations, like the
Okay.
Shift Network is
Mm-hmm.
one,
Oh
and
yeah.
and
Mm-hmm.
the Omega. We're doing what we call breath medicine. We're doing a breath medicine online thing with
Mm-hmm.
Omega. Well, it might even be next week.
Mm-hmm.
Um, in terms of the professional side, the I'm an older person, and so I'm thinking about, well, what happens to the Institute of Integral Qigong and Tai Chi? What happens to my consulting practice? What happens to the Circle of Life Coach Institute?
Mm-hmm.
And so we've founded a nonprofit, and we do a lot of work with that. And so the people that I have trained, like the best of the people that I have trained as Qigong and Tai Chi teachers,
Mm-hmm.
are now the faculty.
Yeah.
And so we just finished our first online level 1 of a 3-level 200-hour Qigong and Tai Chi teacher training.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually, those people will be the face of the Institute of Integral Qigong and Tai Chi.
Mm-hmm.
My photograph will be on the wall in an office that nobody ever goes into.
It's so. I love people who think about legacy, but think about legacy as something that they don't necessarily leave their name all over it, but something that they hand down. It really
Mm,
speaks to me as an ethos. So I really adore that you shared that with us. I feel like it's a really beautiful thing to be doing.
thank you for acknowledging that. And
Mm.
I've just got the gene for wanting to raise others up.
Mm.
People don't always come with the best self-esteem. So
Yeah.
if you just hammer that person
Mm.
with inspiration about themselves,
Mm-hmm.
and that's what our coaching program, this what we call the Circle of Life,
Mm-hmm.
is all about, supporting people and understanding how incredibly powerful they are.
Mm.
And then one of the most important parts of Yang Sheng is Qigong and Tai Chi.
Mm-hmm.
So it all weaves into this. We have like a
Circle of
little,
life.
yeah, we have a world. We have a world over here.
It sounds awesome. It sounds amazing. we will link to all of this in the show notes as well. We will make sure that all of your websites, etc., are available. With that, is there anything else you would like to share with our listeners today? Any topic we haven't covered that you want to dig into? Any open loops for you?
Well, 2 things.
Mm.
One, very briefly, to say that the most profound medicine that you can get anywhere is produced within you when you acknowledge that and then cultivate that.
Mm.
And that does require some focus and some discipline.
Mm.
But imagine if you never had to go to a doctor's office or sit around in a drugstore while you're waiting for them to prepare a pharmaceutical
Mm-hmm.
with all these sick people around.
Mm.
It just doesn't make any sense that nobody knows, nobody talks about the fact that the most profound medicine is produced within the human body for free.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that I'll say, and this is just like my favorite thing to say,
Mm-hmm.
and that is, besides I love you, everybody, and thank you, Victoria, so much for your marvelous hospitality and your curiosity and your support for for people.
Mm.
And it goes like this: there's an aspect of ourself which is irrevocably well, cannot get sick, and does not die.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for joining me today, Roger. I've really appreciated every second.
What a pleasure. Wish you well. Take care.
Thank you once again for listening to the Unveiled podcast. Please do check out the show notes and find Dr. Roger and check out his institute in Santa Barbara. And if you live in Santa Barbara, it may be something that you might be interested in to go and get trained by one of the world's best. All right, with that, all that's left to say is thank you for joining us, and I'll speak to you next week on the Unveiled podcast.